Tech Talent Charter, if you have been lost in your emails, not sure what's going on, the sorts of things that I'd love you to be aware of are, we did have our festival. Hurrah! 1st and 2nd of March. It was super. Lots of people downloaded, but I know a lot of people said, we had a lot of people saying, I'm really sorry I couldn't come. I'm not doing that, etc. This is still available. This is a 2-day festival set full of panel discussions, and they're now on video. So if you go to our events page, to the old festival page, you can look at any of those panel discussions and listen to them. Also, interestingly, Karen's working hard behind the scenes to turn these into podcasts. We've heard from a lot of people that you'd like some content that you could just listen to while you're working. So stay tuned. Podcasts are soon to become a thing here at the Tech Talent Charter. Secondly, many of you have already seen that we have our annual report. If you haven't had a look, we will be dropping links in the chat for you to have that. This is a chance for you to hear what the data is. It's a chance to hear what's interesting. For the first year, this is the chance that we have had to look through, looking at our most gender inclusive companies, our most ethnicity inclusive companies, and then overall, and to then look at the top strategies. So if you want to know what are the top 10 strategies used by companies who are most gender diverse, we've got that to share with you. If you want to know on that on terms of ethnicity or in general. Also remember, part of that report is the benchmarking tools. This is where you can take your data that you gave us and you can compare yourself against the whole of the Tech Talent Charter. You can compare that of companies of your size or your sector. And it's interesting for us this year because we are now about 16% of the entire tech workforce. So this makes the data comparable with the government's ONS data. Really exciting in that piece. So if you have a chance, have a look at that, download that, see how you measure up. Other things to be looking at, we just had a working lunch. The working lunch this time was sponsored by Experis, and it was a link in from what had been at a previous hackathon. This is focusing on how companies are using internal cross-skilling, upskilling schemes to go to work in their company. And it's companies of all sizes. So if you start to think, a lot of our companies are realizing alternate routes into tech, that's the only way we're going to get enough talent in the room. But they so often are looking outside the office. How do we get outsiders in? More and more of our employers are saying, hang on a minute, we have people internally that would love that opportunity to retrain, or we know their jobs are at risk. So hear how companies are thinking about how to create those internal systems for cross-training, for upskilling. That's a working lunch. That will be available from next week on video, and we're happy to share that with you. Speaking of hackathons, we have another hackathon set of teams kicking off on the 26th of April. Now, if you are someone who has some expertise and wants to work with a small team to try and create all the great best practice out there, we'd love to have you sign up. The 3 big topics that we're looking at is making hybrid working work. Okay, as we're coming out of the broken world, and I hope we stay out, it's interesting to hear from companies how we look at hybrid. You know, what happened under COVID was not flexible working. It was enforced remote working. Now, as companies are trying to form things, we have the ingredients of the best or the worst of all possible worlds. So what we're looking at, what is the best practice to make sure that hybrid working remains inclusive and helps diversity, that we're not creating shadow structures, mummy structures, the ins and the outs and that sort of piece. The second topic that we're looking at is how can companies use data-driven tools to improve the attraction for their recruitment processes. So if that's a topic, we'd love to work with you. And finally, if you remember from the festival, we're really trying to start thinking about things that we're referring to as those invisible lenses. And one of those invisible lenses that we've heard again and again from you as signatories are really, really important is neurodiversity. All right. Now, as the breakthroughs are happening and we're getting more and more understanding of what neurodiversity is, it's important for us employers to start thinking about how can we remove barriers so that we can attract, we can recruit, and we can retain and grow people who are neurodiverse. So if that's a topic that you have some expertise and interested in, we're going to the first topic because that's a huge topic. We'll be looking at culture. How do you create an inclusive culture for neurodiversity to flourish? So those are 3 topics for 3 teams for our hackathons. If you don't know what a hackathon is, if you want to hear what it's like, you'll get a link to this in the chat. You'll see what the hackathons are, and you can actually hear from people who have been on hackathons to let you know what you're signing up for. Nearly there, guys. The next thing that should be happening is next week. You should be receiving in your inboxes a request, and this is a genuine, heartfelt request. I need your help. We pride ourselves that we are here with and for our members. And in order to do that, we need to know from you what's working, what's not working. So we have our annual survey. Now, look, we were going through those questions. We've gone through them with a fine-tooth comb. There were only 10 questions, and by all accounts, it can take about 3 to 4 minutes to complete. So please, if you could, look out next week. Feel free to share it with other people within your team who work with us at the Tech Talent Charter, that annual survey. We really need those results. We use them. We go through them with a fine-tooth comb to really understand how we can change, improve what we're doing to make sure that it works for you. Other things to think about in the real world, if you're in London and know about Tech London Advocates, I will be speaking at a Tech London Advocate meeting tomorrow in real 3D. If you're going to be there, please give me a shout out. It's quite weird being back in the 3D world. If I know that I've got some friendly faces, it will be lovely to see you there. One of our other partners is We Are the City. They have an event. It's a virtual event on Friday. You'll hear from me. You'll hear from some of our partners when we work with We Are the City. So we'd love to see you there. And then looking ahead, we have these monthly sessions. Next month, we're going to have one on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but it's a growing topic from a lot of our employers. Menopause. Did you know that happens to some of your employees? Did you know that if you want to be really inclusive as an employer, you need to think about that. You need to think about how can you build policies, culture to keep people thriving, keep women thriving as they're going through the menopause. That will be next month. We'll hear from someone from Codurance who'll be talking about that. And then looking ahead in the next few months, topics that we're thinking about bringing in, mentoring. How can you make mentoring a really effective program within your company? And we're also looking at, each time I've had these drop-in sessions, someone has been asking about, what about data outside the UK? If you're a company that is trying to think about how in your other offices that you might be using the same practices of gathering inclusive data and diversity data, that will be a session to drop in before that. I think that's all of my announcements. So I get to lean back because I think I've made my way through the list, unless Karen messages me something of, oh God, you forgot that again. I'm really coming to the highlight for today's session. What we've heard, some of you have seen this on social media, and we've had a lot of questions about, when you're building an inclusive culture, one of the most powerful things that can help make it feel inclusive or can tear it apart is our use of language. Thinking about how our language within the workplace, and then in particular within our tech teams, can be more inclusive is a really powerful step forward as you're building that inclusive culture. So I was delighted to realize when we were doing some pre-records and thinking and planning for our festival, one of our partners, our principal partners, is global. The principal partners are companies that invest in us to make sure that everything we do is free. Global is one of our partners, and they were actually one of our very first signatories. When we look at our founding partners for the Tech Talent Charter before we were even a thing, we know that David Henderson of Global was at that table believing in it and making it happen. So it wasn't a surprise, but it was really great to realize that at Global, the teams there had really starting to lean in and thinking about inclusive language. And that's what we want to talk about today. So as we're talking, please feel free to drop in questions. And then once I've had a chance to talk to Scott and Gadi a bit, we'll open for questions. But also, if your organization is on this journey and you want to share what you're doing in the space, we'd love to hear from you today. Okay, so Scott, Gadi, thank you for joining me this morning. I really appreciate you being my first guinea pigs, all right, for our drop-in session. I promise not to break you this time. We'll be recording this, not the questions. This is the session that we'll share afterwards. Scott, Gadi, do you want to introduce yourselves to the room?
Gadi, after you. Yeah, thanks. Hi everyone. My name is Gadi Tellez. I'm one of the tech leads in Global with commercial technology, working in programmatic area. Been in Global for about 3 years by now, just over 3 years. And yeah, I guess that's me.
Super, thanks, Gadi.
Hi everyone, I'm Scott. So I'm a change manager at Global, and I'm also the co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee within Tech and Digital. So I've obviously got quite a keen interest in all things D&I, and I co-chair that with David Henderson, as Debbie mentioned a second ago. So I've been here about 4 years, and I've kind of been a product owner and now a change manager, and I've seen all the different sides of tech, and I think that this is just a really exciting conversation to be a part of.
Good, lovely. All right, and I think really in the context of what you both said, and I think to reassure everyone on the call, this is about a long journey, isn't it? And it's only when you're on the journey to have that inclusive culture that you can really start thinking about language. And I know both of you, when we talked about planning this, kept saying, please make sure everyone knows in the group, this isn't fixed, this isn't a magic answer, etc. But within that context, Scott, can you talk me, what was the genesis of this? Where did language start becoming an issue?
I think it was, I was talking to Dave about this the other day, and I think it actually started with him being in conversations and just being in meetings and hearing the way that people were speaking and becoming acutely aware that some of the language was making him feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I mean, specifically, I guess the terms master and slave are really commonly used in technology, and that's probably a very obvious one that a lot of people consider to be offensive now. And this was in kind of 2019. So Dave, after being in a meeting, hearing that, kind of took that away and really thought about it, and then decided to open that conversation up to more people at Global and just ask if people had any other thoughts or opinions about those terms or others. And he was quite kind of shocked really at the amount of feedback that came back about some other terms generally that were being used, and sometimes just in really small phrases and ways of speaking. And I know that Dave kind of cited to me that he once said that he was pregnant with a decision, and to him that seemed like a really small thing to say, but for other people that's quite big. And I think the one thing about Dave that's really good is that he's very keen to just open those as conversations, and nothing's off limits. So he kind of started the ball rolling and essentially set up a group of people in 2019 to just start collating all of the terms and start having these conversations. And that's kind of where we started. And then I guess over the last couple of years, we've tried to bring those terms into the fore and start to make sure that people are aware that those are terms that we don't want to use anymore. And Dave also did contact a lot of our partners to say, please, can you have a think about when you're bringing your teams into work at Global, these terms actually aren't acceptable to us anymore. So can you please just review these with your teams and try and encourage them not to use them? And I think the important thing, as you said, is when it was never going to be an overnight fix. And the truth is that you can still be in conversations at Global and some of these terms do still pop up. And I think it's about being on that journey and how do we, as Gadi will probably touch on a bit later, how do we enforce it in a way that is quite soft and nourishing to people, but also at the same time making sure that we're being really clear on what is and isn't acceptable to us from a language perspective.
Thanks, Scott. And I think there's several pieces of the puzzle that are really important. There's somebody at the start that championed and created that safe space to do it, but it's not owned by any certain person. And it sounds really people driven. One of the things I loved when I was talking to you and Gadi was there was a sense of someone brought something up in a meeting, and as Globalers, it was actually at the heart of the culture, this is not a name and shame. This is not a pointing fingers at people. This was something different. Do you want to talk about that and how you sometimes bring each other up short, call each other out on those sorts of things?
Yeah, I guess the way to really kind of hammer that home, I suppose, is that one of the key Global values is about the way that you make people feel. And ultimately, I know from being here for 4 years that I haven't really ever come across anyone at Global that doesn't want that wouldn't kind of consider wanting to make people feel good, and that's the ultimate point of being a Globaler, as we call it here. And I think that if everyone is open-minded, and if you feel like you're in an environment like we are, then people are quite willing to just kind of mention to people that actually maybe that term isn't what we want to be using, and maybe we should be thinking about using this instead. So I think it's just about making sure that there's an open and honest environment. And that's not to say that we will always get it right all the time, but I think for the most part, people are open and willing. And I think it's about creating an awareness. And I mean, truth be told, obviously we started this journey in 2019, and as these things do with these initiatives, they kind of ebb and flow in terms of adoption and how people kind of really truly interact with them. And I think that this year we've got a specific focus again on kind of reinvigorating the diversity and inclusion committee within tech and digital, and Gadi's going to be kind of owning this particular commitment around inclusive language. So I think it's about making sure that we do have someone that is ultimately responsible for that commitment, but then how do we also make sure that everyone else within the team feels equipped enough to have the information and be able to have open and honest conversations with each other about it.
Okay, so let me pull out some other things. I like, because I think there's a powerful shift in dynamic, because a lot of times these discussions around language can get people very defensively, because it's more about what's more important is my intention. Well, I didn't intend to offend you. That's not what I meant. But it's actually changing the whole period. What's important is not my intention. What's important is the impact on the other. And by changing that dynamic, it brings us all into the discussion, isn't it? Because then, is there anybody who would say, no, I really want to offend people. I want to hurt people. I want to make. So when you flip it in that way, not questioning intention, but looking at impact, that's really useful. But again, it's creating that ongoing safe space to call each other out, to remind each other. Because when we're changing language, both with represented and underrepresented groups, we're taking powerfully ingrained, sometimes generationally ingrained habits, and that takes a long time. So I'm hearing one person stepping in, one group bringing together, raising awareness, keeping the discussion, creating that space, but then it ebbs and flows. And people would probably say over the last 2 years, there's been a few distractions, a few things happening that may have made us look at other things. But it takes those moments when you realize we want to go from an informal awareness raising into doing something more powerful. And I like that what you did is that went from a committee to a person taking a lead on that. And I've got to say as well, Gadi, when you talk about this, I'm going to bring you in now. Too often, one of the things I love about Global is the partnership that you have. There's not a D&I over here and HR over here and tech over there. It's together. And where we see that actually that tech teams are taking ownership in this piece, things will really change when it's done with people. So Gadi, you inherited this project. Tell me how that's been going.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's when you include people from different areas where I think the biggest impact is. So yeah, having people from different areas in this diversity and inclusive committee, I think that's what has sparked different approaches. So my personal approach on this, like having experienced this journey that we've been kind of like from 2019, like yes, we want to do this. I think that the approach at the moment, what took place at that point was kind of like, okay, let's communicate this. Like, how do we best communicate this across the teams so that we are all on the same page? And that took place. It was an initial phase where in meetings, in discussion, like specifically to like, okay, this is what we want to put in place. And it was being involved on that side made me realize that it was great. That it was very welcome by everyone in the team. It's like, yeah, this is actually something that we want to be part of. But then eventually, gradually, as we have said, this is like part of awareness, but this is also part of a big journey. I think what naturally happened was like it started fading away. So that reminder of like, oh, actually, we have to set up a reinforcement session, and how often do you do it? And that's where I noticed that maybe that is something that we can focus on a little bit more. Is something that how do we raise this awareness kind of like constantly, and that's when I proposed this, where we could have something that kind of like an automation part of our process on what we do, kind of like something that will remind us. It's like these are some of the terms that it would be better not to use. So yeah, that was my thinking straight away. It's like, we have this problem of like how often to reinforce, because yeah, something you've clearly said, like a lot of this is like constant reminder that reinforcement, because of these terms being ingrained with us, and taking it to like, okay, we can do it as part of like our daily task, so that it doesn't have to come in stages like every year, every quarter, but actually it becomes like on our everyday basis.
So you're building this into your code review. I mean, I think that's really powerful. And it is that shift now of, we've gone from that championing, gathering the information and data, awareness raising, to then thinking about how can we systemize? How can we create those things that automate? And I like what you said of moving it from let's review it once a quarter to what could we do? So can you talk me through what you're building and evolving at the moment to systemize that, to automate it?
Yeah, so the proposal is like, yeah, part of how do we do it as part of our everyday task, and what we're working on is like included in our review process, in our building pipeline. So every time that there is the language within the code, there is a check that takes place in this, like, that reviews the list of non-inclusive terms, and in case there is an occurrence of it, just kind of like that warning, that error message to say, it's like, oh, this is a non-inclusive term, please consider these other options as alternatives. So yeah, that is kind of like the general approach. It's now more a conversation to what is the best way to solve it, because depending on how we put it together, how we wire it together, it could be that it becomes unmaintainable again, or something that is more centralized and it's easier to keep track of. So I guess for me, that is a key part, where it's something that is central. It will help expand the message more easily, and it's easier to control again.
And I love the idea of an error message popping up within that code review piece. And and we've seen great effect with that in other areas where, in early days, people were realizing that in writing job descriptions, there was inclusive and there was non-inclusive ways of writing that. And so again, some great devs got in and created checkers where you could put a job description and it will flag up to you. And by doing that, I've had companies say, we don't even need the checker now, because it's changed behavior, it's changed thinking. So in doing that, in automating, it is a great way of those little and often, and that's how we change habits, isn't it? That's a really, really powerful piece. And Scott, how is that going? Gadi's now bringing that through. How is the rest of the company reacting to that?
I think it's still in its infancy, and I think that there's obviously a lot of conversations that need to happen. But I think one of the things that's kind of really good is that the engagement around the tech and digital committee generally at the moment seems to be really good. We've just got another committee member that's joined a couple of weeks ago, and so we're now kind of on a bit of a mission to make sure that we share these messages more consistently. So we'll be starting to attend all of the different team meetings in tech and digital over the next few weeks to kind of give updates on our commitments and where we're at. And so I think in specific to the inclusive term stuff, there's a general willingness really with all of these things. I think it's just about how we make sure that we land them in the right way, and we give them enough breathing room as well, because these are not easy behaviors to change sometimes. These are things, as you say, that have been learned over years and years and years, generations, and we need to kind of break that cycle. So I think it's how do we kind of operationally manage these things, but then I think there's also a separate conversation about how do we encourage a general kind of allyship within our teams, because I think it's only by starting there. Obviously, we Gadi's kind of focus is primarily on the tech part, and that's why we've got him doing this, because he thinks in that way and I don't. And then when I think about this, I think about more from a people perspective. How can we have these conversations and empower people to feel like they can be the right ally on behalf of other groups, because it shouldn't be on a specific group to call out terms that make them feel offended. It should be about everyone doing that.
And it was interesting. I was speaking at an invite at an event last night, and it was more women than men, but the men in the room were raising their hands and asking, how can I be an ally? What can I do? So that the systems are powerful, but only if they're brought along with the people change and the allyship with it as well. Now, I'm going to come back to you guys in a second, but I wanted to pick up, I'm noticing on the side. So Chris from Nationwide, can you come on camera for a second? So Nationwide, again, one of those founding partners. Ian Andrews is actually one of our directors. Not a surprise that you've got things going on at Nationwide. Do you want to talk to me about, you've raised a similar sort of issue about how you've been tackling that at Nationwide. Do you want to share with us what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Is my audio okay? Can you hear?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So we spent a few years, talking about inclusive language, talking about why certain terms are offensive to different groups and why we should have more awareness of that. I work in the technology governance area, so I'm all about the rules. of what you should and shouldn't do, what you must and must not do. And I decided to turn a lot of this good intention into actions. So I created a technology guardrail, which usually talks about things like, this is how you should use this database technology, this is how you should, hide card data, data retention, etc. So we started with a list of terms that you must not use, and a list of terms that we would prefer you not to use, with explanations of why they shouldn't be used and what alternatives are. There was a lot of discussion around, well, we don't need this. You shouldn't give people rules as to what they should or shouldn't use. It was a very short list that we started with, but what we found was the greatest benefit was it gave people confidence to actually speak up and have discussions in their teams. So people would say, oh, you do realize, that we shouldn't be using blacklist, and it's not me. I don't have a problem with it. It's Chris McAvoy in his guardrail. It's, it says we mustn't.
Provided cloud cover, yeah.
Exactly, and that was the main thing we found. It was a stimulus to provoking discussion, and also to give people the confidence to speak up and not feel like they're the one challenging someone else or naming and shaming them. And we found that's worked really, really well. And because it's in the form of technology, that again makes it a little bit less human and a little bit less personal. So you can talk about it in the context of technology. And we found that was a safer way for people to discuss it. Although, of course, it's about people and inclusion. What we did recently is we just updated the guardrail last month, and we moved into, just from a technology perspective, how you should refer to people. So we talk about using people's preferred names rather than their legal names. And as part of that, we collected 150 stories from people as to why they use their preferred name. And that wasn't focused on any dimension of diversity, it covered everything. And we found that's worked really well. So we don't actually, we haven't gone after anyone who doesn't follow these rules, but we monitor the language that's used across Jira, Confluence, SharePoint, Microsoft Streams. And we use that as an indication of the use of the language. And then we also use it to we might have discussions with people. Interestingly, what we found is we had a blip of the non-inclusive terms being used more in recorded meetings and in Jira tickets as well. And when we went and looked at them, we found they were mainly discussions around why they shouldn't use those terms.
Okay, good.
That's
so initially a very scary piece of data,
it was. It was, yes. But when we did the deep dive, we found actually it was people saying, actually, we shouldn't use this term anymore. This is the reason why. And, and the discussions that always come up are, well, I don't find it offensive, so why should anyone else? That's number one. So I would say, even though having rules might seem a bit extreme, but as I'm autistic, I love a rule if it's not nonsensical. It actually provoked debate and discussion, and it gave people confidence. So that was all I wanted to
That's super. Really appreciate you sharing that. So let me hear some of the things in which you're doing, because remember, there's no single journey. So and with Nationwide being a much more spread out organization in that respect and everything else, those rules and those very firm rules, and I like the idea of the guardrail, and they shouldn't use and best not to use, with suggestions. But then it's the discussion, because I think on both sides, this is what we're hearing, is the discussions, that the awareness raising is crucial. And in the awareness raising, it's that shifting away. Now, Scott, you guys, in terms of how your culture was set up, one of your core values made that a very easy default to go into, because I think, Chris, what you were talking about is a common pushback. That's not my intention, and it doesn't offend me. And that's very unempowering for others in the room who don't feel they have that voice. But by turning into, and I think, Chris, what you did, which it sounds like Scott and Global were able to do through discussions and culture, but for Nationwide, you could use storytelling. And I think storytelling and people being able to tell their story and why that feels right. And whether that happens in informal ways through discussion groups, or as you were saying, Chris, in meetings that come up afterwards, but that story piece, so people understand and engage with the why. And I think it's a powerful shift. Yeah, go ahead.
So, and that's why we collected the 150 stories about why people have a preferred name. And it goes from the whole gamut of, so me, I'm Christopher, but, you know, no one calls me that, I'm Chris. But I have my legal name because my parents named me that. And the only person who ever calls me Christopher is my mum when she's telling me off. And that's a kind of really common example. I'd like to just talk about something on the other side around discussion. We also get people who push very hard for certain terms to be on the must not use list. And I'll give an example of one recently, black hat hacker and white hat hacker. Yeah. So in the security world, that's one where it's people use different language. And someone came to me and said, you must put that on the must not use list. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that, because in our people and culture community, they use the Edward de Bono 6 thinking hats, where white hat is information and facts, black hat is risks, difficulties and problems. So you can see the use there is problematic. But I said, until we've spoken to our people in HR and they're happy to use different terminology, we're not going to put it on the must not use list, because we haven't got organizational support for that. So that's another part of it. We get people who push for a massive long list of terms, and I say no unless we've got organizational buy-in across the board.
Taking people with you. Gadi, Scott, did you have pushback? Do you still have some pushback on that? And how did you tackle that? Or did it go relatively easily?
In a way, I've experienced something similar to what Chris said, but like it sparks that conversation, because when we similarly have this list of terms that it's like this is kind of like the ones that we have cited that are non-inclusive, then that created some questions as like, oh, how come this other one is not there, and this other company has another list, so which one should be? So I think we did see similar conversation to like, what is that list, like what is the guideline that we should be following, and I think that would be kind of like an ongoing conversation. I personally haven't heard much of a pushback. That is not my intention. I think with the maybe with the courses that were set out of Global were about unconscious bias and inclusivity, like with that help realize that it's like, it might not be what the intention is, but kind of like, how does it make feel other people? So I personally haven't seen much of a pushback, but I don't know, Scott, if you have something different.
No, I mean, any conversations I have had about it, people are generally very open, and I think again, I think it goes back to the way it's communicated, right? If someone can articulate why something makes them feel uncomfortable, or if they're being an ally and kind of articulate it in the right way, then no one else can argue with the fact that that someone else is offended, right? It's about the way that it's framed, and so I think it just kind of goes back to how we have those conversations, and some people probably feel way more comfortable than others, and that's probably a part that we need to focus on in terms of how do we make sure that everyone feels completely empowered and they feel like their voice is going to be heard, and that's something that is definitely a work in progress.
And I think it always will be, because this is about inclusion, isn't it? This isn't about a fix. Kerry, can I bring you in? Because you're doing some research on this, aren't you? And then you were talking about some things that are going on at Lancaster University.
Hi, yeah. So I'm doing an MBA, and part of my I'm actually looking at co-working spaces and how people are certain groups possibly are put off working in co-working spaces because of the culture possibly, or the language that's used, or that's what I'm researching really, is to find out why. But language is an important part of it, and I was kind of looking at language from a sort of what's put on websites, what's out there in the sort of digital footprint, as well as language that's used within the building, and I'm interested in all this kind of stuff, because it's one thing doing it in an organisation, but actually if you're in a co-working space, it's kind of what are the rules that need to be set within that space to make it safe and etc. So I'm kind of looking at that. But what was interesting is I started talking to a couple of researchers at Lancaster Uni, And I've mentioned the decoders that you can find online, and they and they said there's definitely a place for them, but they're looking at doing some research in there to have a little bit more of a dive into why some of the words appear on those decoders, because most of the decoders don't really explain why those words have been chosen, or kind of look at them in context. And what was really interesting is one of the context words we looked at was leadership and leaders. And so if a job description, for example, says, oh, we need leaders, and kind of really goes big town on that, and it's almost like the great man theory kind of leadership sort of idea, therefore that's kind of really, for females, that's kind of really off-putting. Whereas if you kind of go within the text, well, you need leadership skills and blah 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 blah, that is put in a way that actually is more gender neutral and more kind of appealing to a wider sort of gender range. And so they're looking at that kind of nuance and being able to probably go the next step of suggesting what you should do instead of the word that you've chosen to use, and looking at that. But I just think it's a really interesting,
I think it's fascinating. And I'm Arv, I'm going to bring you in a second, but I think, Carrie, what you're talking about, I know a lot of us are asking, can I have a guide? Can I have a guide? But I think, as Carrie's alluding to, and we've seen in both organizations, it's not the list, whatever that list is, that's the magic, is it? It's the conversations, the why, the suggesting alternatives, and creating that culture where there's discussion. It's not about the naming and shaming. So Arv, can you come on and tell us about the Milton Keynes College Group? Because that sounds an interesting piece.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you. No, absolutely. I joined MK College last year, and having worked in a DE&I space for a while, the first thing that I've always really tried to instill is that safe space within the organisation to then be able to have honest conversations, because we can introduce things, but if people don't feel ready to accept what you want to discuss in an open and honest way, then those conversations become meaningless. So giving people a framework, help supporting them in using language that may engage more people, which is the thing. It's not about this is the word that you've got to use and this one isn't. This is about how do you engage more people in a conversation to improve outcomes for all, whether it's your workforce or whether it's your learners. And the language is such a crucial part of that, whether it's in these Zoom meetings, whether it's in Teams meetings, whether it's in person, whether you're standing in front of a group of students and you want them to improve their outcomes, using language that engages them in a positive way, and you being mindful about how do you bring more people into the conversation has got to be a good thing. So the guide wasn't exactly as you just said. It's not the Bible. It's not the this is how you must talk. And so there's an education piece that goes around anytime you introduce the language, guys, because there will be some people that will think you're telling me how to speak, and then you'll have people on the other side saying this is exactly how I need to speak and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to call out anybody that doesn't speak that way. Neither one of those are conducive to a positive, engaging environment.
Perfect. Thank you.
So the comms piece, the education piece before you launch, and how do you bring people into that discussion is really, really important. And then the next step is be open to have discussions about what you've produced.
Okay, so we're nearly to the end. I think this is one of the best sessions we've had. Gadi, Scott, thank you for being my guinea pigs to do this for the first. Listen, thank you to the rest of you that came on camera, shared these sorts of things. Karen's going to try and grab all of that. We'll be putting that into the open playbook. We'll be sharing this. But here's where I think we landed. It needs some champions, some people to start setting out that groundwork, to raise the awareness, to create the space where it is safe to call it out, but it's safe to be on that learning journey. That it is that informal piece that we gather, and some kind of framework, some kind of way of gathering those words to stimulate conversation, to understand the why, to move it away. It's not what our intention is, it's the impact on others. And then I'm getting quite excited about where these guides or even automating these things can come up. So listen, we'll want to hear back from you in global as this evolves. I would love to hear more at Nationwide, how it's evolving. Carrie, as you work on your research, let's hear more. Arv, I'll love to hear what's happening at MK College. To all of you, I promise you I wanted to get you back to your desk. I really appreciate it. Now, Karen's going to send you, please give me feedback. If there's other topics you want to hear about, if you want to hear more about this, please let us know. I hope we have you come for another of our drop-in sessions. Next time, we're talking about menopause, a word that used to make people gasp, men and women in the room, and look quite shifty. But there are some companies that are really leaning in to make a difference and make sure they're inclusive from this lens as well. Thank you, everyone. I'm Debbie. Well, thank you for joining us at the Tech Talent Charter, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.